Okay, so for those of you who were here last week, you know what the score is. For those of you who weren't, we are taking a little bit of a detour in our Belgic Confession study, and we are going through the books of the Bibles in chunks. And I am talking thematically about each one, giving a theme verse, a short summary, and also how each one of the books of the Bible points to Christ. We ended last week with the book of Deuteronomy, which actually marked the end of an era. It marked the end of the Israelites' wilderness wandering after they were delivered or rescued from Egypt, and it marked the end of Moses' leadership of God's people. So as a fulfillment of the promise that God made to Abraham in the book of Genesis, his descendants were about to enter into the land of Canaan, and they were under the leadership now of Moses' successor, Joshua, which brings us to the book of Joshua. Now, the theme of the book of Joshua is as follows. God uses Joshua to lead his people to victorious rest in the promised land. And we see that on play in Joshua 11:23. So Joshua took the entire land, just as the Lord had directed Moses, and he gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal divisions. Then the land had rest from war. So, in taking over leadership from Moses, Joshua's job description is clear. He must lead the Israelites into the land that God had promised their ancestors. And this would not be a simple task. This job would be filled at times with fear and doubt, and there would be some disheartening losses and setbacks as they tried to take this land. And there were many battles to be fought, and there were many fierce enemies that vigorously opposed them and the God that they worshiped. But God reassured Joshua that he would be with him and that he would never forsake him. God promised that he would ultimately give the Israelites victory under the leadership of this man whose name literally means the Lord gives victory. Under Joshua's leadership, the Israelites crossed over the Jordan River into the promised land. They began to fight those battles, and as they did, the Israelites had to be reminded repeatedly that their military victories were integrally tied to the health of their relationship with God. Well, eventually, in the book of Joshua, the battles were won, and the land was divided up and settled. When the Israelites finally achieved victorious rest in the promised land, they renewed their commitment to serve this God who had delivered them and guided them and led them to victory. And that was appropriate because God had indeed done great things for Israel. But God had even greater things planned for his people. In the future, he would deliver them, guide them, and lead them to victory over the oldest of human problems, that of sin, through his own Son, which brings us to the Christ focus of Joshua. The name Jesus is the Greek form of the Hebrew name Joshua. But unlike Joshua, Jesus both fights alongside of his people and is himself the God who brings ultimate victory. Just as Joshua encouraged the Israelites to keep their eyes focused on the source of their victory and not to rely on anything or anyone else, Jesus does the same for us. He reminds us that our peace and our rest and our victory comes from him alone. Well, that's about as positive as it gets for a while, because now we move from the book of Joshua into the book of Judges. Theme: God raises up judges to rescue his errant people from the consequences of their rebellion. Judges 2, verse 16 and 17. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers had walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's command. So, summary, Book of Judges. After the Israelites entered the promised land and took it in the book of Joshua, we expect them to live out their lives in peaceful contentment and trust in their gracious God who had brought them victory, but such is not the case. After Joshua died, God's people became distracted by the new people and the new religions and the new ways of thinking that they were exposed to in this new land. And then time after time, in being distracted, they forgot about the things that God had done for them and for their ancestors. And so God was forced to remind them of how vulnerable and weak and empty life is without his protecting and providing presence. God allowed the people to be attacked and defeated and oppressed by some of their new neighbors until at least they recognized their error and cried out to him for help. And every time they did it, with relentless grace and mercy, God raised up judges, people that were chosen and equipped by him to deliver his people out of the hands of their enemies, at least until the next time they forgot about him. The period of the Judges, as you'll probably remember from the series I did on this a couple years ago, it is characterized by that vicious cycle of the people turning away from God, and then the other nations surrounding them having some military victories and oppressing them until they get to the point where they've just had enough and they cry out to God, and then they turn back again. Of course, God delivers them. Amazingly, God never gives up on his people. Rather, he repeatedly provided avenues for rescue. Now, the judges that he used are a fascinating and diverse group of characters. Among them are a left-handed assassin, a fighting prophetess, a mighty warrior who ends up offering his own daughter as a human sacrifice, a busy father with 30 sons and 30 daughters, and a long-haired strong man who killed 1,000 Philistines with nothing but the jawbone of a donkey. Now, the fact that each one of those judges, each one of those deliverers that God raised up had a very prominent, significant character flaw only highlights the fact that it was ultimately God who was doing the delivering in each one of those circumstances. And the depressing cycle of rebellion and rescue in the book of Judges highlights the fact that there needs to be something better. There needs to be an ultimate divine rescue, which of course brings us to the Christ focus in the book of Judges. Just as the Israelites repeatedly turned from the way of life that God had instructed them to live, that God had shown them to live, we too often stray from the path that God has laid out before us. For that reason, God has raised up for us the ultimate deliverer or judge in Jesus Christ. He delivers us from sin's consequences. He also picks us up and dusts us off and sets us back on the right path. Yes, the deliverers that God used during the time of the judges were both flawed and temporary, but the ultimate deliverer, Jesus Christ, has no flaws. So, his rescue of those who believe in him is complete and everlasting. So, when you look at even the disgusting, despicable, depressing book of Judges, when you look at Judges with a Christ focus, even hope can be found in Judges. Which brings us to Ruth. Ruth, a much more positive book, nice story, happy ending. The theme: God uses Ruth and Boaz to fill Naomi's emptiness by providing her with food and a son. The verses that I'll point out are from Ruth chapter 4, verses 14 and 15. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth." The events in the book of Ruth take place during the time of the Judges. And it records how God works through a very specific and actually tragic family situation. And so in the book of Ruth, we're immediately introduced to a woman named Naomi. And in just 5 short, anguish-filled verses, Naomi moves to a foreign country, loses her husband and both of her sons, and she is left with nothing except her daughter-in-law, Ruth. Now, Naomi and Ruth, still grieving the loss of their family, also face the frightening reality of no resources and no means of supporting themselves. They head back to the land of Israel, with Naomi acknowledging that she went away full and now is returning empty. But in the midst of this emptiness, God is still at work. First, Ruth, who is not even an Israelite, pledges herself to her mother-in-law, Naomi. And next, as Ruth is doing all that she can to provide for the needs of herself and Naomi, she encounters this man named Boaz, who, as it turns out, is Naomi's relative and kinsman redeemer. What's a kinsman redeemer? Such a person had the responsibility for providing for the needs not only of his own immediate family, but also for the needs of his extended family as well. And so God had providentially led Ruth to Boaz and provided for Ruth and Naomi through him. Boaz fulfills his responsibility as kinsman redeemer for Naomi and Ruth. In fact, he went well beyond what was required and actually married Ruth, ensuring that Naomi would be provided for the rest of her life. So the emptiness that characterized Naomi's life at the beginning of the narrative is replaced by this fullness that has been brought about by the Lord. She enjoys abundance and a renewed future. And Ruth eventually bears a son who will become the forefather of one who brings about an even greater redemption for his own family. Which brings us to the Christ focus in Ruth. Naomi was just as powerless to effect her own redemption as we are to effect our redemption. Until God brought Ruth into contact with Boaz, there was nothing but emptiness ahead for Naomi. But God works behind the scenes to provide her with wonderful things: a full, secure life and even a grandson. That grandson, Obed, would grow up to become the grandfather of David, who would become king of Israel. And as we know, David would become the ancestor to an even greater king, Jesus Christ. So God's providential provision of a redeemer for Naomi will in time also become his providential provision of a redeemer for all those whom God adopts as his own family. God became flesh in Jesus Christ in order to become our kinsman redeemer and to fill our emptiness with a fullness of life. Now, because we are covering so much ground tonight, I am combining the books of Samuel, the books of Kings, and the books of Chronicles. So that brings us to 1st and 2nd Samuel with a theme of God exalts the weak and humbles the proud. 1 Samuel 2, the Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. Summary, 1 Samuel describes the period from the birth of Samuel, who was the last of the judges, to the death of King Saul, who was the first of Israelites' kings. And 2 Samuel describes most of the reign of King David. Now, the kings of the Israelites were not supposed to rule the same way as the kings of other nations. A king in Israel was not to rule by his own authority and strength, but rather by the authority and the direction and the guidance and the power of God. However, the reality that power and authority are ultimately in God's hands is and was a difficult lesson to learn. So let's look at some of the events in the books of Samuel. Perhaps the most popular, the most familiar is that of David and Goliath. And in that story, we see how God turns the humble trust of a shepherd boy into victory over a giant and a giant ego. Now, though God would later raise David up all the way out of obscurity to the kingship of Israel and would promise him an enduring kingdom, God would humble even David when David forgot who was ultimately in control. Yes, even David, the one after God's own heart, the one to whom God had promised an eternal kingdom, had faults and occasionally needed divine humbling. God himself would have to provide a perfect king, which brings us to the Christ focus. God did fulfill his promise to David. A distant descendant of David's would indeed occupy his throne forever. And because Jesus himself is God, all power and authority are already his. And yet, remember Jesus' life. Remember what we learn about him in the New Testament. Jesus put those divine attributes aside to become a human being. A human being who would both humble himself and also be terribly demeaned by others. Unlike David, Jesus perfectly obeyed his Father's will, even when that obedience led to rejection and humiliation and torture and death. But because Jesus humbled himself in this way, God the Father has exalted him to a kingship that makes all past, present, and future rulers pale in significance. God has exalted the humbled Christ to an eternal and all-powerful kingship. The one who allowed himself to be overpowered by earthly rulers is now the one who has all authority, not only on earth, but also in heaven. 1 and 2 Kings theme. God expels Israel and Judah from his presence in the promised land when their kings turn away from Torah, or God's instruction. 2 Kings 17:20, therefore the Lord rejected all the people of Israel. He afflicted them and gave them into the hands of plunderers until he thrust them from his presence. Again, kind of depressing books. The books of Kings describe how the twin kingdoms of Israel in the north and Judah in the south drifted off the road of life until they ended up overturned in the ditch. Both Israel and Judah, apart from only occasional efforts by occasionally good kings, and despite the repeated warning of the prophets, experienced the tragic consequences of turning away from God. Only a remnant of Judah actually would survive in exile. And so these books, or this collective book, explains to the exiled community while they were exiled how things ended up this way. After Solomon's reign, Solomon was the son of King David. After Solomon's reign and the subsequent division of the kingdom, the northern kingdom of Israel stepped out on the wrong foot under King Jeroboam, whose first major act was setting up golden calves in the north and the south of his kingdom to provide alternate sources of worship for his people. That was his first act. Despite strong warnings from the prophets, Elijah and Elisha among them, Israel just continued its downward spiral. Their rejection of God became so complete that he had no choice but to remove them from his presence in 722 BC by means of the invading Assyrian army. Southern kingdom of Judah held out a little bit longer, but its fate was the same. Good kings such as Hezekiah and Josiah tried to stem the tide, but ultimately their efforts were in vain. With compassion and patience, God used his prophets to plead with his people, turn back and experience the life that God desires for you. But the people refused to listen. God removed Judah from the promised land in 586 BC, this time by means of the Babylonians. Now these, like the Judges, are not easy books to read. They lay out for Israel and Judah the reasons why they missed out on life and were instead experiencing the crushing emptiness and disappointment and misery of exile. But exile is not the last word from God. Yes, judgment must be experienced, but God, in his grace and mercy, as I said before, never gives up on his people. Christ focus. Our turning away from God requires judgment as well. I mean, God simply cannot be holy and just and simply excuse sin, and we have all sinned. Incredibly, God, in his grace and mercy, has provided a way out of this seemingly impossible situation that we have gotten ourselves into. Jesus paid the price of our turning away so that we could turn back to God. First and Second Chronicles theme. God encourages now post-exilic Israel by means of an account of Davidic kings who acknowledge the Lord's rule. 2 Chronicles 7, verses 17 and 18. As for you, if you walk before me as David your father did, and do all I command, and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne as I covenanted with David your father when I said, you shall never fail to have a man to rule over Israel. Summary. The books of Chronicles cover much of the same history as the books of the Kings. But where the books of the Kings were directed toward the exiled people of God to explain how their actions had brought divine judgment upon themselves, the book of Chronicles now are directed toward the people of God after they had returned from exile. These books are intended to answer the question that many of those returned exiles had, namely, do we still have a future with God? Well, by means of genealogies, I think they're found in chapter 1 and chapter 26. I could be wrong on that. Chronicles reminds the returned exiles of how God has preserved his people. And what better way to show that than to show it through a genealogy, one generation to another. Even though the last half of 2 Chronicles describes the reigns of the last kings of Judah, who almost without exception did evil in the eyes of the Lord, the book ends with the decree granting the exiles permission to return to the promised land. Israel has only survived because of God's faithfulness. And it left the exiles, or the returned exiles, asking, if only there were a king in the line of David who would perfectly keep God's instructions and so ensure God's enduring fellowship with his people. The books of Chronicles encourage the returned exiles to trust that God's promise to David would someday lead to just such a king. And of course, that brings us to the Christ focus in Chronicles. Just as the books of Chronicles encouraged the returning exiles by means of an account of Davidic kings who sought to do the Lord's will, so God encourages us by means of an account of that future Davidic king, Jesus. Future to them, not to us. Jesus has perfectly accomplished all that the Father has commanded. His royal throne is established forever, and he leads his people into a deeper relationship with God. Okay, home stretch. Ezra. We're doing okay here. You guys doing okay? I know this is probably the most ground we're going to cover in the Bible in this series. We got 3 more to go. Ezra Theme. God brings the exiles back to Jerusalem and directs that his temple be rebuilt. Ezra 1 verse 3. Any one of his people among you, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem. So, the Persians had defeated the Babylonians, and God moved the heart of the Persian king Cyrus to decree that the exiled Israelites could return from Persia to their homeland in Israel. And a good number of them did exactly that. Once they arrived, they began almost immediately to rebuild the temple, that physical symbol of God's presence in their midst. Well, after the temple had been rebuilt and its services resumed, Ezra arrived in Jerusalem. But he finds that though the temple had been rebuilt, the people still need to repair their own relationship with God. See, upon their return, they did this good thing of trying to rebuild the temple, God's presence, that symbol of God's presence in their midst, but they also intermarried with other people in that vicinity who worshiped other gods. And in doing so, they made themselves vulnerable to being drawn away from God once again. I mean, talk about, coming back from exile where they had been punished and then doing something immediately that required further punishment. It's terrible. They had once again rejected the will and the word of God in favor of their own desires. See, that true temple, the true temple where God desires to dwell, is in the hearts of his people. So what did Ezra do? Ezra encouraged God's people to work as diligently on their personal spiritual lives as they had in their efforts to rebuild the temple. Which brings us to the Christ focus. In time, God would dwell among his people in an even more personal and remarkable way. He would send his son Jesus to initiate the construction of a new kind of temple. The new temple brought together the visible place of God's presence among his people with a personal relationship with each one of his people. So the temple is no longer a place to visit God, but rather his very dwelling that we form as God's people. Nehemiah theme. God moves the returned exiles to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. Nehemiah 2 verse 17. Then I said to them, you see the trouble that we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and we will no longer be in disgrace. So 14 years had passed since God's people returned to Jerusalem from exile. Children had been born in those 14 years that had never known life in exile. And for them, it was just normal to live among the ruins of Jerusalem. Now, of course, these children had heard their parents' stories of the glory of Jerusalem in the past, but it was hard to imagine that these stones and timbers were once a shining city. Ezra had pleaded with their parents to keep their focus on the Lord and not allow themselves to be lured away from their devotion to Him by the people that were living around them worshiping other gods. But it was very difficult to maintain such distinctions when the boundaries between the people of God and the people of other gods was so blurry. God sent Nehemiah to help them in this situation. Nehemiah, who was the cupbearer to another Persian king, Artaxerxes, arrived in Jerusalem and began to take the steps necessary to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. Despite severe opposition, through sacrifice and great effort, the wall was completed, and the visible distinctiveness of God's people began to have a parallel effect in their lives. They began to look after the poor in their midst. They confessed their sins. They recommitted themselves to following the laws God had given them for their own good. They were once again a distinct people, a channel of God's blessing to the nations. Christ focus, Jesus, and those united to Him by faith are also distinct from those who don't know Him. Our citizenship is in a new kingdom, the kingdom of heaven. Our motivations and goals are different from those of our neighbors. We serve a different God than they do. Christ's true home and that of His disciples is not of this world. We live here for now, but our citizenship, as I said, is in a different place. And so even now, we bear the stamp of the kingdom of heaven, where all citizens look increasingly like its King, Jesus Christ. Which brings us to our final book of the night, Esther. Theme: God providentially provides Esther and Mordecai to bring Israel deliverance from her enemies. Esther 4, verse 14. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. Love that verse. Esther was an orphan living in Persia, raised by her cousin Mordecai. They were Jews living in Persia. And when Esther came of age, she was, by royal decree, brought into the king's harem, which doesn't sound all of that great, at least to me. But of all his concubines, Esther pleased King Xerxes the most, and he made her his queen. That sounds a little bit better. Not to me, but I would guess for a young girl growing up or something, okay? He made her his queen. Little did Esther know that God had providentially placed her in that position so that she might bring about the deliverance of her people, of God's people, from Haman, this evil man who was bent on annihilating the Jews, every last one of them. In fact, Haman actually, through deception and conniving, succeeded in persuading the king to issue a decree to do just that. So there is the life of a people in the balance in the book of Esther. And Esther was forced to put her own life in jeopardy by going to the king and actually revealing to the king her ethnicity, that she too was one of these Jews, and by appealing to the king for the lives of her people. Well, as the situation played out, Haman died upon the gallows that he had intended for Esther's cousin Mordecai. And at Esther's request, the king decreed that the Jews had the right to protect themselves from that time on against any who might attack them. Therefore, by God's providential working through Esther and Mordecai, the Jews were saved. Christ focus in Esther. Interesting to be talking about the Christ focus in Esther because God is not mentioned once in that entire book. I don't know if you remember that from when I preached on that a few years ago. For the Jews under Persian rule, the odds were stacked against them. Their only hope was that the one to whom all authorities must answer would somehow provide for their deliverance. And God did just that through Esther and Mordecai. Now, for human beings living under the rule of sin, the odds are stacked against us as well. Our only hope is that God will provide deliverance for us. And God did just that through his Son, Jesus Christ. God became human at just the right time to bring about his salvation for us. Made it through. Let's bow our heads in prayer.